Hi, XFed here. This video is dedicated to explaining my emotional and personality developmental history. Um, why I process things kind of the way I do. It's just to give a brief overview. It's not going to go into any particular depth on any real topics. It's not going to discuss specific circumstances per se, and in general, I'm going to avoid naming individuals and organizations that I'm describing as a means of legally protecting myself, but also um, if I decide to address them, it will be at a later time in a different setting, different context, and with substantially more evidence readily available. As a warning, many of the topics presented here require advanced training in the field of psychology or personal experience to fully understand. As such, please understand what I am describing is my own unique experiences with trauma, suicide and suicidal ideation, the absolute darkest sides of humanity, abuse, and a number of other topics. So with that warning out of the way, let's get right into it. So just to make kind of a disclaimer, something to keep in mind as I'm going through these descriptions, abuse is pretty constantly present in my developmental stages of life. And abuse is generally present from roughly the age of 6, maybe earlier, to about 19. And when I say that, I mean physical and mental abuse. Emotional abuse is something that actually kind of continues into today, unfortunately. But again, I'm not going to give specifics regarding that. It's just a note for watchers to bear in mind as we're going through this, that abuse is pretty much constantly present, and that it's not continuous, it's not at a continuous level, not consistent. In addition to abuse not being consistent in terms of the severity of what I was experiencing or being made to deal with, abuse shaped many aspects of my emotional and mental development, and I carry those shapings with me today. No doubt watchers will note that I provide statements in a very matter-of-fact manner. It comes across as overconfidence, arrogance sometimes, especially in interpersonal conversations. In a video, it's maybe less of an issue, but in discussions with people, it can certainly be off-putting, and I'm aware of it. Please don't let that presence discount any of the information that I'm sharing with you, though. Moving on, my childhood was generally describable as an unstable household. My biological parents divorced very early on in my life, before I can even remember. And typical of divorcees with children, there was a lot of fighting. There was a lot of bickering over various topics and hardships to each party, which were then in various ways transferred to me. I spent a lot of time moving. The parent that I was living with full time, or the majority of the time, moved a lot. When I say moved a lot, I mean by the time I was 18, I sat down and counted, and I could recall at least 19 times where I had moved. I had, as a result of moving, very few friends. It was very difficult to establish friendships. And in the context of abuse, it was very isolating. And the stunting of emotional development played a large factor in my ability to relate to others and to speak to them. It still does. I had 3 primary abusers. I'm not going to go into detail on who they were or what their roles were, but it led to a troubled childhood. As a teenager, I continued to develop from a troubled child to a troubled teen. No surprise there. I began drinking around the age of 8, as I recall. And then I began heavily drinking, stealing alcohol, hard alcohol, vodka and rum, things like that. Around the age of 11 or 12, due to severe abuse that was going on at the time. There was a lot of fighting. I fought with a lot of other kids, a lot of other troubled kids, suspensions, and I was expelled, I think, 3 different times from my childhood to my teen years. I was eligible for more, but it was unfortunate. As a teenager, I began having suicidal ideation, and it was associated with wanting to escape the circumstances in which I was living. And eventually, at the age of 14, I attempted to commit suicide. I won't go into the details on what was related. Obviously, the attempt failed, thankfully. And that was the first time, and that was planned. Again, I'm not going to give specifics about the individual, but just to give context into the personality development and the severity of issues that I had to deal with in order to help people who are watching this eventually understand. There was a circumstance where one of my abusers became aware of my suicidal ideation, and this happened about 3 months after my initial planned attempt. And this was, again, I was 14. I had communicated suicidal ideation, and one of my primary abusers was made aware of this and was angry. And this primary abuser had done a lot of things, had threatened to harm or kill me, had been a very central figure and the worst abuser by far in my life. And this abuser came to me shortly after they were notified that I was having suicidal ideation. And they had a conversation with me that was tantamount to, I heard you were feeling suicidal. I'm tired of dealing with this shit. And proceeded to hand me a loaded gun and told me to shoot myself. And at the time, it was 50-50 as to whether or not I was going to do it. Eventually, though, I broke down crying and obviously didn't shoot myself, but it was something that I was not equipped at 14 to be able to process. And that abuser would later go on to abuse their authority and position of trust to remove anybody that I trusted and had shared this event and the details about it with. It was a very difficult circumstance, and I was emotionally and physically isolated at this time by my abuser, plural. And at this time, around the age of 14, there was basically 24-hour, 7 days a week abuse going on because even in circumstances where I left one household, I would go to another household and there would be a different set of challenges and abuse going on. So related to these difficult times with abuse, I began escaping into books and began just reading, trying to understand, trying to find the words to describe what I was going through, trying to reach out, and my interests were varied, so it wasn't like a concerted effort to learn how to describe or to relay what I was going through and what I was feeling and dealing with. And I ended up stumbling across the poetry of Robert Frost pretty early on. And this is important because poetry is powerful. Because what matters is not what the writer meant, but what the writing meant to you as an individual. And for me, reading The Road Not Taken at 14, it gave me a sense of awareness about my life and choices that I could make, of where my life was headed, and the ability to choose a different life and outcomes than the path life had set me down at that moment. Because the kinds of things that I went through broadly, without going into detail, set me up for a life of crime, to be a criminal, or to commit suicide. And generally speaking, people who go through these types of circumstances growing up wind up in prison or dead. And that was the path that I was originally headed down. I made choices to be different. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Over time, once I stopped living with one of my primary abusers around the age of 15, the worst abuser, to be clear, I began eventually getting help. I found people I could talk to professionally, and I don't think they were psychologists per se, therapists per se, just people I could talk to. And I began working through a lot of the traumas and trying to empathize and understand my abusers. This led to the formation of some generally pacifistic thoughts, trying to, in general, value life above all. Empathizing with people who are your attackers, your enemies. And in general, being an idealistic late teens person, believing that I would be willing to give my life, even if it meant to my enemy, um, to align with my values and beliefs. At the end of my teenage years, I became an early adult, entered into the U.S. military, and I'll eventually talk about this in another video about my professional background. But for now, just to give context to what I'm about to say, I worked in intelligence, and I had exposure to a lot of things. And beginning in basic, there was a lot of re-traumatization, unfortunately. Basic was, I think the more common vernacular that people use today is basic was triggering. It was triggering trauma, memories, and flashbacks related to PTSD that had been formed in my early childhood. Post-traumatic stress disorder, if you're not familiar with the term, because of the severe events that I had gone through. And basic was like living with my worst traumatizer, and it was hard. I eventually made it through, though, and eventually began my work in intelligence. And I have to be careful here, because now we are transitioning into topics that, depending on the level of detail that I give, require me to seek authorization and permission from the Department of Defense to publish. So I'm going to be extremely vague, extremely high level, so that this remains at an unclassified level. So any Department of Defense reviewers, if you are watching this, I am carefully navigating this. Please leave me alone. Uh, my intelligence work exposed me to, and the military in general, exposed me to the darkest sides of humanity. I I was exposed to things that involved, at an unclassified level, murder, torture, and general warfare. And this description will not in any way, shape, or form do it justice. If there are veterans watching this, they will understand what I mean, what I'm talking about. And that work, from a personality and emotional perspective, destroyed everything that I believed as somebody who was becoming a pacifist. It challenged what I fundamentally believed deep down, which was As a pacifist, I believed that people were fundamentally good, that they made poor decisions based on the context of their situations and bad influences. But when confronted with this new level of malevolence, of it's hard to describe it in words without going into specific details. So I hope the viewers watching this understand that I'm struggling to provide you enough details so that you can understand what I'm saying, where I'm coming from, and why I think the way I do, but without traumatizing you yourself. Even the descriptions alone of what I have seen and been through are traumatizing. Even to hear about it has been traumatizing for some. So please understand, viewer, that I am trying not to harm you, just to help you understand me. What broke me was watching people harm and kill others and have fun doing it. They made it a game. Again, I'm not going to describe exactly what I'm talking about. This is going to be hard for somebody who doesn't have PTSD to understand. I am reliving, replaying this in my head as I'm describing this to you. It's not a choice. These memories are locked in. There are hormones and memory formation triggers that are associated with fight or flight. You know, the possibility that you may die in extreme stress situations, and it causes memory formation so that these memories are they're just beneath the surface, and all it takes is a reminder or to talk about them to immediately have access to those memories. But that's a side note. But anyway, the things that broke me challenged everything I believed about the goodness, the fundamental goodness of people. I couldn't cope. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't come to terms with it. I couldn't process it. I was just emotionally broken, shut down, withdrawn. In addition to feeling like I was living in the same circumstances, being reminded of my primary abuser growing up. I left the military shortly thereafter, and I struggled to come to terms with this new information and this evidence that contradicted everything I believed about people, that seemed to anyway. And for a year after I left the military, I approached suicide from a cognitive perspective. Did I want to live in a world filled with the kind of things that I had seen, with the kind of people that I didn't want to believe existed? And I gave myself a year, 1 year exactly, to decide whether or not I wanted to die or live, knowing that if I was going to live, I was going to have to change how I viewed the world, how I approached it, and how I lived in it. And so I ultimately did decide to live. I'm here. But what changed was how I viewed the world. And I have a quote up on my screen that I want to read to make sure that I don't misquote the general. General James Mathis, who is a U.S. Marine Corps general, he made a quote to Marines in Iraq who were fighting for their lives. That was the context of his quote, but my point in sharing it with you is that this quote accurately summarizes how I approached life moving forward. And I'll explain what it means to me. Be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody you meet. And what that means is you don't trust people, not 100%. I stopped trusting people fully. To this day, I trust no one 100%. And that's unfortunate because, as an astute viewer may have noticed, I am married. My wife knows this. It's not her fault. It's just not just because of the trauma, but the things I was exposed to in military intelligence. I don't trust anybody. That's the best I can give you as a viewer without going into detail and without reaching into the classified realms. The other part of that is to have contingencies. To be ready to deal with betrayal. People who decide not to do what they should be doing. And decide to behave in a way that is perhaps unethical, illegal, or dangerous. And so my emotional and personality developmental progression, along with my philosophy, changed to holding people accountable, especially in circumstances where they did terrible things. One thing I didn't go over that was relevant in the military, because I was traumatized on multiple fronts, not just by what I was exposed to, but also by the people that I worked with, one of whom is a central figure, and I will not name them here, intentionally caused permanent damage to my body, including damage to my joints and nervous system. And is more or less directly responsible for me waking up in pain every single day, being in pain every single day, related to the nerve damage. Not being able to engage in certain activities, especially things like running. And my goals became to learn rapidly about systems in order to have people held accountable to the law, to society in general. And also to change how I viewed suicide moving forward, because by this point in my life, I was 21, I believe, I had revisited the idea of suicide so many times that I needed to address it. I realized I needed to address it. So I also changed how I viewed suicide. It no longer became an option for me. And for clear context, this was more than 15 years ago. And I began changing how I viewed suicide. And eventually, over time, I stopped having thoughts of, like, for example, nobody wants me here. Nobody would care if I'm gone. Nobody or everybody would be sad if I died, things like that. People would regret it. I stopped having those ideas of self-pity because I understood that nobody actually would care. I mean, life would go on. There would be, I shouldn't say nobody would care. There are people who would care, but they're few. And life would go on. My death would be just part of a statistic. And my new beliefs also led me to want to live a life of righteousness and no regrets. I mean, this was true from the time of 14 when I was not believed in some circumstances about that situation involving being handed a gun and the fallout that came afterwards because people just didn't believe me. I was a shitty kid. I drank a lot, I fought a lot, I got suspended a lot. Nobody wanted to believe me. My credibility, my reputation preceded me. And that was terrible. So I did my best to stop lying from that point moving forward. I stopped drinking. I stopped doing a lot of things because I realized how important integrity was. And as an adult, an early adult, coming out of the military, dealing with the things I was dealing with, that included, and I'll discuss this more in my professional, in my video regarding my professional history, but dealing with some of the terrible things that happened, including violations of civil rights and a number of other illegal activities that happened. I began to want to try to prevent others from going through what I had been going through and began understanding from a larger perspective that I wanted to help those who had experienced what I experienced survive. Because it's difficult to live through these things. And just as a side note, and this is going to be relevant to all of the military veterans as well. When I turned 21, I legally obtained my first handgun. I already had other weapons, but from that point forward, I began sleeping with a gun under my pillow. I still do. I mean, I'm not gonna show anything on video, but there's one about 6 inches from me, and it has to do with feeling safe and not feeling safe, and also being ready to hold people accountable who try to attack you and harm you, and proper and legal use of force if necessary. And these are concepts that are going to be difficult for the average civilian viewer to understand. If you haven't had training in these matters, if you haven't had a circumstance where you've truly had to consider whether or not you would kill somebody or risk killing somebody to try to protect yourself or those you care about, your loved ones, then it's going to be a difficult perspective to understand. It's going to be foreign, alien, and disturbing to some. But again, this is to help you understand me. And this part may be hard to understand, so you may have to do additional research along with a lot of the other topics discussed in these videos. But anyway, so that's all for my emotional and personality developmental history. Look forward to seeing you guys on the next one. XFed out.